Good afternoon. My name is Olivia Kefauver, and I'm a Senior Environmental Studies Policy Major at Colby College. Today I will be presenting the first chapter in the Environmental Policy Review, Key Issues in Ethiopia 2011. My research is titled How Public Institutions Facilitate or Constrain the Activities of Environmental NGOs in Ethiopia. Ethiopia is considered one of the most important biodiversity hotspots in the world, but also one of the most degraded. The country faces numerous environmental challenges that pose significant risks for Ethiopian citizens, since much of Ethiopia's population is dependent upon the environment as their principal source of income. Political, social, and economic challenges within Ethiopia can contribute to and be exacerbated by environmental degradation. Ethiopia faces not only the economic development challenge of any low-income country, but also the challenge of a new government creating its own institutional structure to best serve its citizens' needs. In this context, the development of strong institutions and networks is a necessity to address environmental degradation and management of natural resources. As such, my research question for this project was, how do public institutions facilitate or constrain the activities of environmental NGOs in Ethiopia? I looked at institutions at national and regional scales. To gain a comprehensive understanding of my topic, I conducted a literature review and key informant interviews. Among those contacted were the EPA, Ministry of Justice, national and international NGOs, and academics. Finally, I chose two NGOs as case studies, Forum for Environment, a national NGO, and Concern for Environment, a regional NGO. Douglas North has described institutions as humanly devised constraints that govern human interaction. Institutions consist of formal constraints, informal constraints, and enforcement characteristics. The structure of environmental institutions frames the way in which environmental problems are approached and, in turn, the extent to which tangible results are produced. A key component of environmental management is how policies, once adopted, are carried out. Eugene Bardock developed a metaphor for understanding policy implementation that provides a way of conceptualizing the environmental policy process. Bardock likens implementation to a machine. In order for it to work, all the parts must be assembled and kept in place. To begin, a working machine is dependent on proper design. If the correct design is in place, but the necessary elements are lacking or unreliable, then the policy implementation machine will be ineffective and the desired results will not be produced. While rules that addressed environmental aspects existed prior to the Derg regime, specific institutions focused on environmental issues weren't present until the Derg government took power in 1975. During the Derg regime, top-down environmental legislation emanated from socialist principles where the state acted as owner and manager of land and natural resources, with little regard paid to local participation and community empowerment. After the 1991 overthrow of the Derg, most of the conservation and development activities of the time were destroyed in protest. The current government represented a drastic ideological shift. Formal environmental institutions were put into place, and policies that emphasized participatory approaches to environmental management were instituted. During this government, there was extensive development of environmental policies. Sectoral policies cover many areas such as water, wildlife, and rural land use, in addition to the Environmental Policy of Ethiopia, or the EPE, which serves as the national framework. The EPE addresses implementation, policy review, evaluation, and need for participatory management. The current government emphasized decentralization of government to improve management and accountability. At present, major administrative levels include regions, zones, and worietas. In 1995, a federal structure was established relegating administrative and fiscal responsibilities to these administrative subdivisions. In 2002, a further decentralization designated worietas as centers for service delivery and project implementation. The Federal Institution for Environmental Management is the Environmental Protection Authority, or EPA, which is in charge of the development of environmental legislation and policy, monitoring and implementing environmental impact assessments, among other responsibilities. At present, only 6 of 11 regions have regional environmental protection agencies responsible for environmental management and implementation, while worietas have no formal or specific environmental management institutions in place. Historically, NGOs have operated under difficult circumstances. The imperial and Derg regimes were wary of independent civil activity, but reluctantly allowed international NGOs to work during periods of extreme famine. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, the NGO sector has been small and dominated by international NGOs rather than national NGOs. As seen in this figure, under the current government, the NGO sector has seen a drastic rise in the number of NGOs working in Ethiopia. While there's no data for the years 2002 to 2006, in 2007 you can see a large increase in the number of national NGOs in general, with 1,742 national NGOs as compared to 234 international NGOs in 2007. Despite this expansion of the NGO sector, the Ethiopian government is still wary of NGOs as a whole. In 2009, the Charities and Societies Proclamation regulated the source of NGOs' funding based on the NGO's place of registration, nationality, and focus areas. This law restricts NGOs registered as Ethiopian charities and societies from receiving more than 10% of their funding from foreign sources. Activities like human and democratic rights advocacy and promotion of efficiency of justice and law services are reserved for the Ethiopian charities category. This law is considered one of the most restrictive NGO laws in the world, as it essentially bars NGOs in this category from receiving any significant amount of foreign aid, which in low-income countries such as Ethiopia is a considerable setback. While not applicable to every NGO type, it is indicative of the policy environment for NGOs within Ethiopia as a whole. For my key informant interviews, I spoke with 5 respondents in 4 fields via phone, email, and Skype, using semi-structured interviews to explore how environmental policy impacts NGOs and vice versa. Respondents' comments were largely centered around the thematic areas of environmental policy, policy implementation, and the NGO-government relationship. On the whole, environmental policies are believed to be fairly comprehensive in addressing the necessary environmental sectors by my respondents. The EPE serves as a framework for regional environmental policies and sets base pollution standards. Regions may make their environmental policies more stringent than the federal policy, but may not set standards lower than the federal law. Environmental laws aren't perceived to have a negative impact on the work of NGOs. On the contrary, my case studies stated that existing policy makes it easier to operate. Implementation was identified by respondents as the main problem with environmental legislation. Respondents from 2 NGOs explained that the implementation problem wasn't unique to the environmental sector. Rather, it was the problem of any developing country. Respondents from different domains such as the Ethiopian EPA, a law professor, and NGOs identified the same factors constraining implementation, citing inadequate manpower for enforcement, expertise, facilities, and funding for programs, while the challenges of balancing investment and implementation of environmental policy were also noted. Legally, there seems to be no problem working on environmental issues as an NGO as long as their statutes are focused solely on environmental issues. Compared to humanitarian NGOs, environmental NGOs enjoy a special relationship with the Ethiopian government. The government can assist NGOs by providing environmental data, while environmental NGOs assist the government and especially the EPA with project implementation. My 2 case studies, Forum for Environment and Concern for Environment, represent 2 different but equally important types of environmental NGOs working in Ethiopia today. Forum is a large networking organization working actively on policy advocacy, whereas Concern is a smaller regional organization that works within the existing environmental laws. Based in the capital, Addis Ababa, Forum attempts to influence policy and engage government officials and NGOs at international, national, and regional levels in addition to its work in local communities through networking, policy advocacy, and lobbying campaigns. This map depicts 12 local Forum for Environment groups spread throughout Ethiopia. Through these groups, Forum hopes to build a national environmental movement. Based in Awasa, Concern partners with larger organizations like Forum, but largely refrains from policy advocacy. Instead, Concern for Environment works directly with local stakeholders regionally and on the community levels, focusing primarily on projects, capacity building, and raising environmental awareness within their community. Looking at Bartik's implementation metaphor again, it appears that the problem highlighted by most respondents was actually in the implementation process, in the absence of essential policy elements. Respondents from several different sectors identified the following common sources of implementation problems listed earlier. Based on my informant's responses, I found that the environmental policies exist on paper, but are not implemented in practice. Gaps in implementation indicate a need for capacity building, a need that has been specifically addressed in several recent development plans, but it is clear from my informant's responses that these problems are still very relevant. NGOs play a significant role in environmental management in Ethiopia, and the decentralized nature of Ethiopia's service sector may even necessitate the involvement of NGOs like Forum for Environment and Concern for Environment to achieve these program objectives. The environmental NGO sector seems to be establishing working relationships with the Ethiopian government. However, a tenuous NGO-government relationship remains with the NGO sector as a whole and shouldn't be overlooked. Financial assistance and operating budgets are inadequate for current objectives, and additional funding has the potential to facilitate implementation of environmental policies. In conclusion, the efficacy of environmental legislation is dependent in part upon the strength of environmental policy and in part upon the ability to implement policies. There are significant limitations to implementation capacity within Ethiopia. NGOs currently play a significant role in environmental management and have the potential to address in part these gaps in implementation capacity. However, the political context in which environmental NGOs work can impact their ability to work effectively and as such demands consideration. My policy recommendations include, if looking to adjust or improve existing environmental policies, one should start with a federal policy, since regional policies are held to federal standards. There should be a continued and intensified focus on improving government implementation capacity, and this can be achieved in part by strengthening government NGO resource exchanges and partnerships, and also by attracting international financial assistance until transition can be made to financial independence for Ethiopia. For any questions or comments about this report, please contact myself at the listed email address. For any questions or comments about the Environmental Policy Review, Key Issues in Ethiopia 2011, please contact Tom Kimball at the listed email address. Thank you and good afternoon.